Hi, it's Wendy Cumming-Potvin, EDU 610. I'd like to take stock of our learning for this topic, and looking back, we have looked at how to analyze academic articles. This week we're going to look at qualitative methodologies. We're going to also introduce how we might collect qualitative data, and we're going to have some exciting activities for effectively applying our knowledge. So let's kick off, sit back, and enjoy the ride. So let's just take stock of our learning in EDU 610. What have we been doing for the last while, and what is this all about? So if we look at our objectives, there are a number, and remembering that many of these objectives link to the Murdoch University graduate attributes. So these then are connected to workplace learning. So really, items such as critically analyzing arguments and searching library databases are linked to learning and skills that are much more broad than in this particular unit. So what do we already know about qualitative research? We've already touched on this briefly in EDU 610. So have a think about its purpose and research questions and some of the characteristics and some of the challenges that might be involved in qualitative research. What have you come up with? So what do we know about qualitative methodologies? Well, I would suggest that the term qualitative research is really an umbrella approach. It is a vast term, and if we think of a tent such as the chapiteau for the Cirque du Soleil, there is a wide variety of acts taking place. And this is the same with qualitative research. It's not all the same, and there is a wide repertoire and wide variety of perspectives. But we do know that there are several characteristics that tend to be found in qualitative research. First of all, the context is primordial. So that means that qualitative researchers tend to seek meaning, and that meaning is often deep, thick, and layered. We might see it almost as a spider's web. It is the intricacies that are important. Now, qualitative research could take place in a school, in a hospital, in a medical setting, in a police setting. But the key here is that the research takes place in natural settings. So this is opposed to or different to settings whereby the variables are manipulated. And we also know that qualitative researchers tend to view themselves as the instrument in the research. And this often is due to the fact that the researcher interacts often closely with their participants. So there is much less distance between the researcher and the participants. Now, if we look at data, that data is often described as descriptive, and it can comprise a number of items such as words. There's often a great emphasis on words, but this also might be visuals such as pictures or video clips, particularly as we're living in an increasingly visual society. And myself, I have worked in a number of settings such as schools and classrooms whereby I have gathered data through words and through video clips. Our designs tend to be emergent, meaning that they can shift as we go along. They are often iterative, so it is not a linear process. There's a lovely quote here from Henink, Hutter, and Bailey from 2011. They mention that qualitative research humanizes science. So let's have a look now at some different types of qualitative research. And again, I'm mindful that although these different types are identified as separate entities, there is again a wide range and variety amongst the various different approaches. So if we'd like to look at ethnography, first of all, Walcott from 2005 suggests that ethnography is a way of seeing. And again, there is a wide range of interests. This particular perspective has its roots in anthropology, and you may have heard of the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead. But if we look at ethnography today in contemporary society, we don't need to cross the world and look at different cultures necessarily to create an ethnography. We could study a group in our own city. For example, there is a wonderful researcher in New York named Michelle Fine who studies marginalized youth, amongst others. And perhaps in this case, if you were looking at perhaps homeless youth, then you might want to spend some time in day shelters. Ethnography is often thought about as cultural ways of being and doing. So we want to investigate a group and we want to understand in depth their ways of doing things. And often this is related to extended periods of time. Another great example here is from Shirley Bryce Heath, who was a literacy researcher in the 80s. And her work tracked 2 different towns in the US, some low socioeconomic status and others high, and with populations from different colors, such as there was one that was predominantly white and one town that was predominantly black. And she looked at the literacy practices in these particular towns and how literacy was related to ritual and related to, for instance, bedtime story readings or not. And one item that you might have heard about is in ethnography about going wild, about going native. So that really means that if there is a researcher in the field who at some point just fails to find any distance between themselves and the participants and just becomes native, well then that can be an issue. So apart from ethnography, there is also a perspective in qualitative research called narrative. And obviously many of you have already heard of narrative. And in the arts, often a narrative might be related to novels and the narrative or the way that that particular story is constructed. But here we're talking more about narrative inquiry. And one of the key authors here is Clendenin from 2013. And this narrative perspective has come to the fore since the 80s. And I suppose the rationale here is that our world is filled with stories and has been so for thousands of years if we look at Aboriginal cultures. So this notion of narrative could refer to stories, but it could also refer to data and how the data is processed or analyzed. So it might be a narrative structure or it might be a narrative analysis. Other authors here are Bruner from 1986, who talks about coherence in narratives. And Dewey often is linked to narrative due to that focus on the viewpoint or experiences of participants. So narrative, if we look at Clendenin and Connolly, again key authors in this area, are often connected to time, space, place, and social interaction. Now you might have narratives. In fact, in my research, I have created narratives or used narrative inquiry with teachers or pre-service teachers, with children, with young people, with parents, with engineering students, or with engineers. So you could create a narrative through any number of participants. If we start to look then at case studies, and here one of the key authors is Yin from 2018, a case study could be one single entity. It could be n equals 1. So a case study could be about one person, but it could also be about one institution. And that institution could be a hospital. It could be an educational setting, such as a TAFE, such as a primary school, a high school, or a university. It could be a medical center. It could be a police station. There could be any number of ways into this notion of case study. And I should note here as well that Yin talks about how case studies have become popular in the media as well. So we have case study research, but often we have referred to in feature articles online or in newspapers case studies, for instance, it could be about a crime, it could be about a murder or a murderer, it could be about developers developing housing complexes or real estate officers or any number of roles or professions. But the difference here is that in case study, we construct the case study with, as researchers, some discipline, transparency, and we're also methodic about the procedures that we use. We might use, for example, interviews. We might also use questionnaires. We might use document analysis of particular policy documents or newsletters, or so on and so forth. So again, case study is composed of a variety of different approaches, but there are common threads through this approach. Now finally, we'll have a quick look at action research. And this tends to be related to research which stems from a problem in the field. And a key author here is McNiff from 2017. So for instance, we might have in higher education, at the moment, there's been a new government policy whereby arts degrees are going to be much more expensive than, for example, teaching degrees or degrees in science. So we might question here what might be the impact of this on the field. So there might be people working in the field, professionals, academics, or others, who might be interested in studying this phenomenon. And again, McNiff suggests that action research is almost like a family or families that are diverse. We have different ways of doing action research. But again, if we look at that common thread or characteristic, it might be that there is a practical aspect so that it's linked to professional practice. And it is also about improving our professional practice. So as researchers and those who are on the field who are actually connecting with the researcher, who might also be generating the research, they can ask themselves, what is my role? What is my practice? What is the problem? And how can I improve this? So it's linked also to these kinds of compelling questions. Action research is also linked to an image of a spiraling notion of action reflection. So one of the key characteristics, again then, of action research is reflection or reflexivity. So once we have gone through actions, then we reflect and think about how might we improve for the future. For example, if you were in a nursing setting, you might ask, how can I study my nursing practice to benefit my patients? Or if you were in management or business, you might ask, how might I improve my management strategies for positive outcomes? And often we think of the steps in action research as being the problem or concern, thinking about the way ahead, monitoring, and then evaluating that progress, reflecting, again, exceedingly important, and then amending that model for the future, for the steps ahead. So if we're collecting qualitative data, there are a range of tools. We could, for example, use observations, and this could be in any type of setting, whether it be a health setting, a legal setting, educational setting. But there could also be a combination. You might just be a participant, you might be an observer, but you might also be an observer participant if you are an ethnographer. So there might be a range of tools that you use, such as basically shadowing people, or you might be taking notes as you're shadowing people in a hospital, and so on and so forth. And some other ways of collecting qualitative data, and I've previously mentioned this, but we might use journals, and we might keep our researcher journal, which can be exceedingly important for qualitative research. And we might take notes about the academic articles that we read, but we would also normally take notes about what is happening in the field. Are there dilemmas? Are there unanticipated situations? Are there surprises? Are there situations that are slightly bizarre? You might also ask your participants to keep journals. You might also gather texts such as emails or text messages. As we've mentioned previously, photos or videos might also be sounds or objects or artifacts. You might also gather student work samples. Here is an example on the right from an early childhood setting. But you also might gather documents from the institution in which you are studying or researching, which might be a school or might be a health setting, etc. So here is an example of a participant's reflective log. And this is from some of my earlier research, which was from a REGS grant from 2006, which was an excellence grant. And basically, I just asked these pre-service teachers who were either graduate pre-service teachers or undergraduate pre-service teachers to give me details about the books that they were reading with children. And you can see there the details that I asked for. And then there was the simple question, which was, what did I learn from reading with the children? And then there were key words at the bottom as to whether or not this was a single or repeated reading, whether there was social interaction with the child, what kind of book was it, and what was the reading process like, and was it multiliteracies, meaning was it reading, writing, speaking, listening, and viewing, or were there other modes also involved? Now, if we look at the types of instruments we can use in qualitative data, whether it be interviews or questionnaires. If we look at interviews, we can have what is called unstructured or open-ended, and these are basically like open-ended conversations. More typically, what we see in qualitative research nowadays is what is called the semi-structured interview. So if you were using this type of interview, you would have what we call indicative questions, meaning you would have draft questions, but if the participant took you off onto another lead, you would follow them and then you might bring them back with what we call prompts. I should also note that electronic interviews or questionnaires have become increasingly important and widespread in contemporary society. Now, once again, the types of interviews we can use are different. So you might have a face-to-face interview, you could have a telephone interview, or you could have an electronic interview, which is increasingly common nowadays. The one-on-one is specific, whereas if you have a focus group, you might have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or even a room full of people to create a focus group. And my experience is that the larger the group, the more challenging it can be to manage that social interaction. And in my research, I have completed many one-on-one interviews and focus groups, small ones and up to ones that have been filled, the room filled with participants. And often in those kinds of settings, we need someone to assist us to take notes or to help us animate. So here are a few items for you to think about and check off if you are interviewing. And I will mention that although this is about qualitative research interviewing, these kinds of checklists for interviewing can also be important for educators or for other professionals in different settings. So was the interview setting quiet? Very important for your technology if you want to tape the interview. Did I listen more and talk less? It's very easy for us to talk more than our participants, but really our aim is to hear their voice, not ours. It's about them. Did I avoid leading questions? So the aim is to leave things open-ended and to not steer our participants in one way or the other. Did I withhold judgments? Particularly if the person is from a very different walk of life from you, we need to, as researchers, try as best as we can to withhold our judgments. Was the language meaningful? So were you using language that was appropriate for the type of participant you were interviewing? If you were interviewing a judge or a lawyer or a homeless youth or an early childhood participant, the language would be different. But again, the common thread would be courtesy and respect. No matter who you are interviewing, you need to be very cautious about protecting your participants and treating them with respect and courtesy. So as we collect qualitative data, and this is adapted from Berg and Cresswell, there can be some challenges. Our first challenge can be gaining access to participants. And this often relates to what we call gatekeeping. So gaining access, for instance, to schools can be a challenge because of the gatekeeping. Also, we might be challenged to find people who are interested in conducting an interview or being involved in our research. And this also depends on the topic and the types of tasks that you're asking potential participants. We might also get into an interview setting and then ask a question and our participant responds yes or no, but we really want more than that. So we need to have strategies to probe the interviewees gently so that their responses are extended. Again, it's not about us, it's about their voices. We also need to be prepared for our interview. So we need to check out our technology first. We might need to check out the setting as well. If we're going, for instance, downtown or to another location, another city, and we're not familiar with that environment, we need to be doubly prepared. We also need to find a quiet space for interviews. There's nothing more irritating than having a beautiful interview and then listening to the tape afterwards and finding that there was background noise that was an irritant. And also finding the appropriate documents. Here is an example from some of my more recent research, and this was from an article that I wrote with Kathy Sanford, who is a professor from the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. And that is where I was born, in British Columbia, Canada. And you can see here that we had an example of a focus question, and it was, should primary school students still be taught cursive handwriting? Why or why not? And our participants in this case were pre-service teachers, and they were a mixture of postgraduate pre-service teachers and undergraduate pre-service teachers. And the interaction was taking place online. So you can see what SAFA posted online in relation to this focus question. And I need to advise that Safa is actually a pseudonym, so this is not the participant's real name. We do this to protect the anonymity of our participants. And you can see there the response that Safa gave. Really quite interesting. One of the challenges of qualitative research can also be the amount of data. Some qualitative researchers quite often say, I'm drowning in data. So you can see there from the cartoon that it can be quite a challenge, and it's finding ways to manage that vast amount of data. Coding can be a complex process, so we certainly won't be looking at all aspects of coding today, but just to dip our toes in the field slightly, and this is from Cresswell and Walter, some of the processes might be, you might initially read the data, and you might do that several times. I find myself, I will read transcripts several times to get a feel for the participants' views and the way they speak, the language they use. Then you might divide the text into segments, which again is about managing length. Then you might label the segments with codes, and these might be what is called a priori, which is from the beginning, and then inductive as you move forth. And then to reduce the overlap and redundancy of code, you may start to group some codes. And ultimately, you might collapse these codes into broader themes. And again, you might have some themes when you're starting out, but some themes will surface as you are looking at the data. So you can see here that Cresswell has suggested that there is a process for qualitative data analysis. And I do mention that again, there is variety across these types of perspectives. This is only from Cresswell. So Cresswell suggests that the researcher first collects the data, could be text files, could be field notes. We know it could be visual files as well. Then the researcher prepares the data, or it might be someone else who's preparing it for you. Some researchers have transcribers, and there are companies that do that now. Then you read the data, and you need to read again, and read again, reread. And then you start to code the data, as mentioned previously, using themes and so forth. So I'd just like to recap our learning for this week. We have recapped on academic literature and review of literature, and we've also introduced qualitative research methodologies, and we've looked a little bit at some of the tools that qualitative researchers use, and also started to look at some of that data analysis. Thanks so much for your commitment to the unit, and I shall see you online. Bye for now. Here is our first activity for this topic, and this is from Yale University, and it's with Dr. Leslie Curry, who works in the area of health sciences. And I'm also very excited to present you this resource from Yale University because I had a wonderful opportunity to visit Yale University myself. I think I mentioned to some of you that I'm working on a book, and I was invited to visit Yale University to draw on their special collections for this book. So it was a wonderful experience for me to visit that university, which is meant to be one of the best universities in the world. So if you view this particular video clip and ask yourself, how do these interviews, which again are in the health sciences, in this module, how do they compare or contrast with interviews in the field of education research? And secondly, how does the researcher establish rapport with the interviewee? This is a fundamental component of interviewing successfully. Now for activity 2, we can have a go at preparing an interview guide. So all you need to do is read pages 278 to 279 in your unit text, and it's about the interview guides. So just have a go and please feel free to change the topic of students writing essays and taking examinations to a topic that relates directly to your research question or research problem or the discipline in which you work. And finally, for activity 3, this is about researchers' reflective practice. So all you need to do is click on the URL below to peruse the following document from the University of Birmingham, which talks about keeping a learning journal and the process of reflective practice. And you can ask yourself, how might reflection assist you with your academic learning, your research, or in other areas of life? Have a look at the types of models for reflection that are presented in this text and see whether you prefer that of Sean or that of Gibbs. Looking forward to hearing your comments.